Hello, how is everybody today? I would like to welcome our project leader of the Puritan Great Migration Project, as well as the US Southern Colonies Project. He happens to be Scott McClain, and he also happens to be my project leader for the Southern Colonies. And today we're going to talk about both of these projects. We're going to start with the migration and then go straight into Southern Colonies. Let me go ahead and give you a little bit of information about Scott. He was actually born in New Mexico, but grew up on Army post around Air Force bases overseas. And he's lived in Italy and Germany and returning to Texas, where he went to high school, college, and also law school. So Scott is a practice law as an attorney for many years, mostly for Delta Airlines in Atlanta. So if you've flown Delta Airlines, you can probably have a little bit of thankful to Scott. He's retired now. And guess what? His second career is being a WikiTree genealogist. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Scott, and he's going to talk about the Puritan, migration and the U.S. Southern Colonies.
Thank you, Sandy. And thank you, everyone who has joined. I really appreciate your time, and we're going to jump through a very, very brief and fast pass through an introduction to the Puritan Great Migration Project first, and then the U.S. Southern Colonies Project on WikiTree. The Puritan Great Migration Project, just first a little bit of historical background to understand why we have this project and why it's called the Puritan Great Migration. After the arrival of the Mayflower in New England in 1620, there was a mass migration of people, mostly English Puritans, who came to what became the New England colonies between 1621 and 1640. There were about 20,000 of these migrants, about 15% of them arriving before 1633, and the rest, almost 17,000, arriving in just a 7-year period between 1634 and 1640. This huge migration of people is known as the Puritan Great Migration Project. And those 20,000 immigrants to New England left millions of descendants who are still alive in the United States today. In contrast to the European colonial settlement in most of the rest of the New World, these were mostly families, some of them prosperous, who came to create a new life, and they had large numbers of children, so they left many, many descendants. And although estimates vary, the current estimate is that at least 8 million and many more Americans living today could, if they tried, trace their ancestry back to one of these Puritan Great Migration immigrants. So the Puritan Great Migration Project on WikiTree is designed to facilitate collaboration among WikiTree members, all WikiTree members who are interested in these widely shared common ancestors. It's what's called a topical project, which means it focuses on a specific topic, and the topic, those within the scope of the project, are European colonists known to have arrived in one of the New England colonies between 1621 and 1640. Now, there's a separate project, the Mayflower Project, which deals specifically with the Mayflower passengers who arrived in 1620, if you're interested in that. So the basic goal of the Puritan Great Migration Project, like every other topical project on WikiTree, is to facilitate collaboration on these widely shared common ancestors. Our aspirational goal in the project is that every one of those 20,000 people have a profile on WikiTree that is complete and accurate and supported with good sources, good reliable sources for every factual claim that's included in the profile. Now, that is an aspiration. We certainly aren't there yet, but how do we try? How do we try to facilitate this collaboration? Well, the primary way that the project does this is by acting as a manager or a co-manager on many of the profiles, and ideally all of the profiles, Right now, there are more than 7,500 profiles managed or co-managed by the Puritan Great Migration Project, which are people who have been shown to be present in New England to have arrived in New England between 1621 and 1640. What does project management allow us to do? Well, the answer is that it allows project leadership and others who are active in the project and who want to help us achieve our goals with respect to these common ancestors to monitor every edit to every one of the profiles for quality control, to make sure that any changes are sourced with reliable sources, to make sure that any major edits to these profiles is done in collaboration with the project and with everyone else who's interested in those common ancestors, and also, and importantly, to identify profiles for these people, these 20,000 Puritan Great Migration immigrants that need help, that need care, bios that need attention, that need sources or other profile improvements. And then finally, it helps us mediate disputes. It's inevitable on WikiTree, as you will know, that different people will have strongly held views sometimes about different ways that a profile should be presented. The project allows us to act as a mediator to help resolve those disputes with these commonly shared ancestors. In some cases, not all, but in some cases, the project will also decide to apply what's called project protection to a profile. This is a special status that is applied really only to controversial profiles. Profiles where past edits have shown that the person's origins are disputed, for example, or that they're frequently confused or conflated with other people, or frequently duplicated. Or they're controversial individuals whose lives could be presented in different ways, and different descendants may have strong views about how that should happen on WikiTree. Any profile that is historically the subject of dispute among WikiTree members that falls within the scope of the project is a candidate for project protection. And basically what project protection does, again, all of this is designed to facilitate collaboration. What project protection does is make sure that it prevents anyone from adding relationships, deleting relationships, merging the profile away, or making other significant changes to the profile without collaborating with the project and the profile managers. And you know, with these commonly shared ancestors, unfortunately, it's a problem that there may be unsourced ancestry.com trees or gene.com profiles or whatever that people treat as if they're accurate, even though they're not sourced. Project protection allows the project to prevent those kinds of major changes from happening without collaboration. Okay, our starting point, and really our Bible in the Puritan Great Migration Project, is an epic work that was conducted under the auspices of the New England Historic Genealogical Societies, led by Robert Charles Anderson, known as the Great Migration Series. We are very lucky, those of us interested in New England research, early New England research, are very lucky that most, and at least an enormous amount of the hard work has already been done for us by this project. Since 1988, Robert Charles Anderson has led this project, the goal of which is to create comprehensive biographical and genealogical accounts of all immigrants to New England from 1620 to 1640, from the arrival of the Mayflower to the decline of immigration resulting from the beginning of the Civil War in England. So basically the Mayflower Project and the Puritan Great Migration Project. This Great Migration Project has already generated multi-volume works that create profiles for many of the Puritan Great Migration migrants. There's the first volume is called The Great Migration Begins, a 3-volume set that covers folks who arrived before 1633. The Great Migration, the next set, is a 7-volume set that covers people who arrived in 1634 and 1635. And then there's a more recent book called The Great Migration Directory, which has much shorter lists of relevant sources for everyone who's been identified as arriving in New England between 1620 and 1640. So these works are so comprehensive and so authoritative that the policy of the Puritan Great Migration Project on WikiTree is to follow the conclusions of Anderson in the Great Migration series, unless there is new research or new evidence, new published research in a peer-reviewed journal, or new evidence that's come to light since these works were published. And it makes it much easier for us to standardize the process that we apply to these profiles. These are great resources, by the way, and I'll pitch them for you. The entire searchable text of The Great Migration Begins and the Great Migration 2, we call it, the 7-volume set that covers arrivals between 1634 and 1635, are all available on Ancestry.com if you have a subscription to Ancestry.com, or on AmericanAncestors.org, also a subscription site, but well worth it to have access to these works if you're a New England researcher. The Great Migration Directory is not available yet in those, but you can buy an ebook version of it for $55 from American Ancestors. That's the version I use, and I highly recommend it. They sometimes go on sale for less. But if you're an interested researcher in this area, you need to be familiar with the Great Migration series. So how can the Puritan Great Migration Project help you with your New England research? Well, first, many of the PGM profiles are already in great shape, excellent resources, well-sourced by collaboration among many people, and can give you an enormous amount of information about these ancestors. But in addition to the Great Migration series that I just mentioned, the Puritan Great Migration Project has developed an extensive list of links to online and other resources that can help you with your New England research. And perhaps the best resource, in my opinion, are the friendly genealogists of the Puritan Great Migration Project itself. Several members of the project or others who are active in working on these profiles are credentialed, certified genealogists. Many have published in peer-reviewed genealogical journals, including the New England Historical and Genealogical Register and many others. We pride ourselves on holding each other to a very high research standard, and learning from other project members, frankly, has proved to be one of the best educations that I've received as a genealogist. So I highly recommend that to you, all of you. How can you get involved? Well, the answer is, if you have a research interest in these early New England ancestors, we would love to welcome you and welcome your help in achieving the goals of the project. There are specific instructions on how to join the PGM project on our Puritan Great Migration homepage. Just search for Puritan Great Migration in the WikiTree search box and you will find us. And we hope to hear from you. All right, well, I'm about a minute ahead of time, but I have an enormous amount of material to cover for the second half of this presentation. So with apologies to anyone who joins promptly at 15 minutes after the hour, I'm going to go ahead and forge forward into the second half of the presentation, which is a discussion of the other project that I lead, which is the US Southern Colonies project. The US Southern Colonies project is also a topical project like Puritan Great Migration, but in this case, the scope of the project is focused on profiles for ancestors who were born or who settled in the colonies of Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, or Georgia prior to the American Revolution in 1776. So this covers a huge amount of ground. And it's a much, much bigger project scope than the Puritan Great Migration. To help illustrate how broad that scope is, and also to explain how in the project we try to break this down into more usable chunks, we've organized the project into several subgroups that focus on specific aspects of this broad Southern Colonies overall umbrella. So the first of those subgroups, sort of the top of the US Southern Colonies food chain, I guess you could say, is the Jamestown subgroup. The first permanent the first permanent English settlement in North America occurred in 1607 at Jamestown on the Chesapeake Bay. Now, in contrast to the New England colonies that were founded a little over a decade later, this was a commercial project. It was funded by the Virginia Company, and it was designed to be a money-making enterprise for its investors. And unlike the families that settled New England a decade later, these first Jamestown colonists were soldiers and aristocrats and artisans and laborers. Basically, they were adventurers who came to America to seek their fortune and to seek adventure. And unfortunately for most of them, it did not go very well. The colony was racked by disease, by starvation, and conflict with the native Powhatan Confederacy, which was a powerful confederacy of native tribes that inhabited that region before the English settlers arrived. By 1610, 3 years later, almost 90% of the Jamestown settlers had died. Now, eventually, it did become a profitable enterprise, and this was because it became based on the plantation economy, producing, in the case of Virginia, tobacco, the cash crop tobacco, large plantations owned by small numbers of people and supported by the labor of first indentured servants, many of whom died, and later African slaves. Now, as I said, the original settlers were all men. It wasn't until 1619 that the Virginia Company made a concerted effort to begin bringing women to the colony. And it remained a brutal existence. Many of the colonists continued to die year after year in the early years of its existence. And in 1622, war erupted between the English colonists and the Powhatan Confederacy. In the initial Powhatan attack on the Virginia settlements, nearly a third of the 1,200 settlers then living in the colony were killed. So by 1622, there were still only 800 people living in Virginia. In 1624, the King James revoked the Virginia Company's charter and converted Virginia into a royal colony, which it remained until the Revolution. And so that's the bookends that we use to mark the Jamestown subgroup within the US Southern Colonies project. Those who are proven to have been in Virginia between 1607 and 1625, when a census was taken known as the Jamestown Muster. And the subgroup within the US Southern Colonies project focuses exclusively on the descendants of that very small group of Southern colonists. The second subgroup is the Virginia colony after the Jamestown muster. So this is a vastly, vastly bigger group of people, all ancestors who lived in the colony of Virginia between the time of that muster in 1625 and the American Declaration of Independence in 1776. This is a pattern common to most of the Southern colonies. Virginia developed in two broad ways. First, a wealthy plantation-based economy in the eastern tidewater regions and along the great rivers, supported by indentured servants and slave labor. And a western migration, gradually in the 17th century and then rapidly in the 18th century, including a large migration of Scots-Irish and German settlers down the Great Wagon Road from Maryland and Pennsylvania and Delaware along the Appalachian Valley into the upcountry of Virginia. In 1700, the population of the Virginia colony was already about 80,000 people. And by 1775, it was about 550,000 people. The next subgroup is for the colony of Maryland, or the province of Maryland as it was known. This colony was created by royal charter in 1632, and the first permanent settlement began in 1634. Again, similar patterns to what I just described for Virginia. The eastern tidewater areas and the dominant economy of the colony was plantation-based, again, tobacco production. But there was a heavy settlement in the upcountry in northern Maryland, western Maryland, of small independent farmers, many Scots-Irish and German settlers. In 1700, the population was about 32,000. By 1775, the population was about 200,000, about a third of whom were enslaved people of African origin. The next group, really three subgroups, are for the Carolinas. And this is because the Carolina colony was originally established as a single colony, but was later divided into what we now know as North and South Carolina. North Carolina settlement began really by renegades and refugees from Virginia who began settling the Albemarle region in the mid-1650s. But the colony wasn't officially created until the king granted a charter in 1663 to a group of 8 lords proprietor to thank them for supporting him during the English Civil War. These lords proprietors weren't very interested in the northern part of the colony. They were primarily interested in creating a wealthy plantation-based economy, which I'll talk about in just a second. So that left a vacuum in the north. And by 1700, there were still only about 5,000 English settlers living in the area that would later become North Carolina. In the mid-18th century, though, there was that same large mass migration of Scots-Irish, German, English, and other settlers into the Piedmont and to the Appalachian frontier. In 1775, the population of North Carolina was about 260,000 people, roughly a quarter of which were enslaved people of African origin. Then there was, as I mentioned, South Carolina. Now, the Lords Proprietor were much more interested in this area, and in 1670, they created the first permanent settlement in what would later become South Carolina, near the modern-day city of Charleston. The commercial focus here was the lucrative rice and indigo plantations and later cotton plantations that thrived in these large plantations that made a small number of wealthy planters very, very rich and enslaved enormous numbers of African and the descendants of African slaves. This plantation economy made South Carolina the wealthiest of all of the colonies of the original 13 American colonies, and it remained one of the wealthiest parts of the United States until the Civil War. In addition to the English settlers, there was a large influx of French Huguenots who settled in South Carolina, and like the other colonies I've discussed, the interior upland regions were settled primarily by small yeoman farmers, Scots-Irish, German, French, and English. And there was that same tension and dynamic between the upland small yeoman farmers and the coastal elites in South Carolina. The estimated population of South Carolina in 1700 was just about 5,000 people. By 1775, it was about 175,000 people, of which almost 2/3 were enslaved. And finally, the last subgroup in the US Southern Colonies project is Georgia. The reason for this is that the English settlement of Georgia, the English colony of Georgia, was not established until 1733, primarily as a military buffer between the Carolinas and the Spanish incursions in Florida. Interestingly, slavery was initially banned in the Georgia colony, as was rum, and equally evil lawyers and Catholics. Rum was legalized in 1742, slavery in 1751. Not sure when they started allowing lawyers into the colony, but it became a plantation-based Southern colony, and by 1775, the population of the colony of Georgia was 50,000 people, roughly half of whom were enslaved people of African origin. So all in, there were about 1.2 million people living in the Southern colonies that are within the scope of our project at the time of the American Revolution. And it's estimated that at least 2 million people lived there at some point during the period from 1607 to 1775. There are literally millions and millions of Americans alive today who are descended from these common ancestors. So the US Southern Colonies project, the goals of our project are, like other topical projects, to facilitate collaboration, and cooperation among all WikiTree members who are interested in these widely shared ancestors. And our aspirational goal, again, as with the Puritan Great Migration, is that every one of them should have a well-researched, fully written, well-written narrative supported by reliable sources. How do we do this? Two main ways. Obviously, this is such a large group of people that the project can't even manage more than a tiny, tiny fraction of them. But we do manage profiles, currently about 1,350 profiles. The project acts as a manager or co-manager. We choose the profiles that the project will manage. Primarily, we focus on the earliest ancestors, those born before 1700, and we focus especially on controversial profiles where the person's origins are disputed, where they are confused with others or conflated, where they're frequently duplicated, where they're controversial, and where they're the subject of disputes. The project acts as a mediator and tries to help interested people collaborate successfully on trying to improve these controversial profiles. We also protect some historically significant profiles or profiles that contain an extensive amount of research that we think needs to be preserved. It allows us, this project management allows the project leaders and others who are interested to monitor changes to the profiles, to make sure that changes are properly sourced, to make sure that major edits only occur with collaboration among members, and it allows us to help mediate disputes, as I said. The second major way the project helps with this research is through our system of teams. As I mentioned, there's a colonial team for each one of those groups that I've already described. And each of those colonial groups offers access to meet and collaborate with others who are interested in the same research areas. All of them have developed useful lists of resources for further research, which are available on our project page. And in addition to that, there are a number of profile improvement teams who focus on specific aspects of profile improvement, merging duplicates, for example, improving bios, adding sources, fixing database errors, and so on. So how can you get involved? Well, if you have a research interest in these early Southern colonial ancestors, we would love to welcome you to the US Southern Colonies project. Just search for US Southern Colonies in the WikiTree search box, and you will find us, and it'll give you all the instructions that you need to join and get involved. So thank you very much. Thanks for your attention, and we hope to hear from you.
I want to thank Scott. These are some really great projects. This is great information, and I appreciate you so much for sharing your expertise. But I can tell you on a personal level, if anybody is interested in the Puritan migration or the U.S. Southern Colonies, help is always wanted because of the huge scope. But on a personal level, you will not find a better project leader than Scott. Scott, I love you to death. You're so kind and knowledgeable in your expertise. I highly recommend joining one of these projects and get to know a little bit deeper sourcing, because these do require work. These are not easy peasy, let's just slap a citation on it and done. This does require a lot of work, but they're so much fun working on these. Now, we're really kind of out of time, and I wasn't going to take questions. I was going to tell everybody to contact Scott. I just want to real quickly mention this one comment that I do know that Southern Colonies does collaborate with the U.S. Black Heritage Project a lot. I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of the heavy duty work is done through the Black Heritage Project. And then the bios are kind of coming over from the Southern Colonies.
Yes, that's right. But there's obviously a lot of overlap, for reasons that you can tell from my presentation. And we try to work very closely with that project.
Okay. And then I just wanted to point out too, and thank you, Liz is in the audience in the chat too. And just go to the Southern Colonies page, and you can find information about how to join the Southern Colonies, which Jamestown is a part of.
Absolutely.
Okay. And if you have any other questions, please reach out to Scott. Like I said, he's great. He responds to me instantly. He's really knowledgeable in his expertise. and just a joy to work with. So reach out to Scott. And if you have any questions with either of those or just a general question, that's where I would go. I'm just going to put up one of our exhibitors, Family Tree Magazine. Check them out. They have some fabulous WikiTree specials for WikiTree Day. Other than that, thank you so much, Scott. And this is goodbye.